Canadian cattle farmers are paying nearly $900 million a year in carbon taxes, and that number is about to triple by 2030. For some ranchers, it's the difference between a break-even year and going out of business entirely. This is the reality facing one of Canada's most essential industries. While most Canadians are worried about paying for groceries, worried about their heating bills, worried about inflation, there's an entire sector of food producers quietly drowning under a policy that was supposed to save the planet but is instead threatening their survival. The carbon tax in Canada started in 2019 at $20 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. It seemed manageable at first, then it climbed to $50 per ton by 2022. But the real acceleration came after that. The government decided to increase the tax by $15 per year every single year until it reaches $170 per ton in 2030. That's a commitment to nearly triple the burden on farmers who use propane and natural gas for essential operations. Let me paint a picture of what this actually means for someone operating a cattle farm or feedlot in Canada. James Beckering is the board chair of the National Cattle Feeders Association. He operates a feedlot that uses propane for a steam flaking process. Steam flaking prepares grain by cooking and flattening it, making it more digestible for cattle and more efficient for growth. It's an innovation that improves productivity. Yet, in just 6 months after a recent carbon tax increase, his operation paid $14,000 in carbon tax specifically for this single essential process. That's 75 cents per ton of grain produced. When you multiply that across a full year, the numbers become economically devastating. Consider another example presented to Parliament. A cattle farm using natural gas to heat a calving shed and a small equipment workshop faces an annual carbon tax bill of $6,500. That same-sized operation using propane for steam flaking grain faces $63,000 annually in carbon tax. That's nearly a tenfold difference for what are essentially comparable operations serving the same industry. The second farm is doing something more efficient, yet the tax system penalizes them far more severely. Across all livestock operations in Canada, the average livestock farmer can expect a carbon tax bill of $726 every single month. For crop farmers, that number jumps to $2,024 monthly. For greenhouse operations, it reaches an astonishing $17,173 per month. These aren't theoretical projections or estimates. These are real bills that farmers are receiving and paying from their operating accounts every single month. The Agriculture Carbon Alliance, a coalition of 17 major national farm organizations, including the Canadian Cattle Association, compiled detailed data from farmers across multiple provinces. They asked farmers to submit their actual carbon tax receipts. One farm submitted documentation showing a carbon tax bill of $61,933 in a single month. That same farm is projected to face bills exceeding $894,000 annually by 2030. When you extrapolate this data across Canada's 190,000 farms, you're looking at an industry carrying a burden of nearly $900 million per year, with that figure more than tripling over the coming years. The reason these costs are so high is that farmers have no alternatives to the fuels being taxed. Grain drying is the primary example cited by every farm organization. After harvest, particularly in years with wet weather, Canadian farmers must reduce moisture content in grain to preserve quality and prevent spoilage and mold. There are no viable alternatives at scale. Farmers cannot choose to use electricity or renewable energy. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The technology isn't there. The costs would be prohibitive. They use propane and natural gas because it's literally the only practical option available to them. The same reality applies to heating livestock barns. In a country where winter temperatures regularly drop well below freezing, farmers must maintain minimum temperatures in barns where animals are housed, especially during calving season when newborn calves are most vulnerable. Solar heating doesn't work reliably during Canada's long winter nights. Electric heating systems would require massive infrastructure investments that most farms cannot afford. Biogas systems are promising, but still experimental, expensive, and not yet viable at the scale needed. Farmers didn't choose these fuels. They chose them because there was no other choice. The government recognized this reality and created the return of fuel charge proceeds to farmers' tax credit. The theory was sound. A portion of carbon tax proceeds would flow directly back to farming operations. They also created the Canada Carbon Rebate for small businesses and the Canada Carbon Rebate Program for residents, including farm families. On paper, this looked like a reasonable solution. In practice, it failed to address the actual problem. The rebate system is based on eligible farming expenses, calculated at a standard payment rate applied across all farms. Every farm is different. Operations requiring significant heating pay very different amounts than grain farmers who primarily use fuel for drying. The reality, according to data presented to Parliament, is that farmers are paying substantially more in carbon taxes than they receive back in rebates. The gap is enormous, and it's growing every year. A turkey farmer from Ontario testified to Parliament that he received a carbon tax bill for just under $10,000 in a single year. He wasn't running an inefficient operation. He'd already invested in insulating his barn walls and ceilings. He'd implemented energy efficiencies wherever it made financial sense. He'd done everything right. Yet the rebate he received didn't come close to covering what he paid. That was before the most recent tax increases. By 2030, that same farmer faces projected carbon tax charges of $32,000 annually. The rebate system simply wasn't designed to handle the scale of costs farmers actually face. A mushroom farmer explained that his medium-sized operation employing 100 people pays up to $15,000 per month just for heating and cooling the buildings where mushrooms are grown. That's $180,000 per year. Some mushroom farms documented annual carbon tax costs exceeding $150,000. For context, that's enough to completely destroy the viability of an operation that was previously profitable. Chicken farmers provided data showing average costs of $41,000 annually depending on operation size. In Saskatchewan, in 2022, one hatching egg farmer alone paid $9,000 in carbon tax for just that single year. The impact was unprecedented in agricultural history. This reality created a political crisis. For more than 2 years, farmers have advocated for a solution. Bill C-234 was introduced by Conservative MP Ben Lobb. The bill would amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act to extend an exemption for qualifying farming fuel to natural gas and propane used for specific essential agricultural purposes. The bill had broad political support, which is remarkable in today's divided parliament. The House of Commons voted to pass Bill C-234. Conservatives supported it, members from the NDP supported it, the Bloc Québécois supported it, the Green Party supported it, even 3 Liberal MPs crossed the floor to support it. There was genuine cross-party consensus that this exemption made economic and practical sense. The elected representatives of the people overwhelmingly agreed that farmers deserved relief from the carbon tax burden. Then the bill reached the Senate. The Senate is an appointed chamber, and the amendments made there fundamentally altered the legislation. Senate amendments removed exemptions for fuel used to heat or cool buildings used to raise and house livestock. They also shortened the sunset period from 8 years down to just 3 years. Any relief would be temporary, rather than allowing farmers time to plan and invest in long-term solutions. The parliamentary budget officer analyzed the impact of these Senate amendments. Their report was damning. Under the original bill passed by the House, farmers would have saved approximately $115 million in carbon taxes by 2026. Under the amended version from the Senate, that savings dropped to just $26 million by the same year. The Senate essentially gutted the bill's effectiveness while still claiming to support farmers. They reduced the benefit by more than 70% through legislative amendments, rather than through public debate or democratic process. Even with these severe amendments, the parliamentary budget officer calculated that farmers would still be paying $910 million in carbon taxes by 2030. That's 90% of the original burden. The Senate amendments decided that farmers shouldn't get meaningful relief, and they did so through procedures that removed the decision from the direct democratic process. Public polling conducted by Ledger Research showed that 7 out of 10 Canadians believe farmers should receive an exemption from the carbon tax on natural gas and propane. This wasn't a partisan position. Support was widespread across different regions and political leanings. In Alberta, 76% of residents supported giving farmers a break. In British Columbia, 72%. Even in Quebec and the Atlantic provinces, 68% supported the exemption. Average Canadians understood the connection between farmer economics and food prices. A rancher named Brooke Donaldson from Alberta explained the mechanism clearly. She said, when ranching costs go up, farmers must pass those increases along to the next person in the supply chain. If she must pay carbon tax to heat the barn storing cows, she must sell cows to butchers at higher prices. Those higher prices flow to retailers, then to consumers buying steak or ground beef at the grocery store. It's a direct pipeline from farm economics to dinner table costs. This connection matters particularly because Canadian food prices were already rising. Statistics. Canada forecasted food prices would increase another 4.5% in 2024, adding $16,297 in annual grocery bills for a family of 4. That was before factoring in additional carbon tax burdens on farmers. A Statistics Canada survey from late 2023 revealed that 15% of Canadian households were foregoing basic necessities like food or medicine to heat their homes. Adding pressure to food production costs at that moment seemed economically counterproductive. The cattle industry has an environmental story worth considering. Canadian beef producers are actually leaders in sustainability compared to international competitors. The Canadian Cattle Association released ambitious climate goals for 2030. Ranchers are increasingly adopting sustainable practices. Many implement rotational grazing systems that improve soil health and sequester carbon. They've invested in herd genetics, producing more efficient cattle requiring fewer resources. They've adopted precision agriculture technologies, optimizing feed and water use. These aren't farmers ignoring environmental concerns. They're actively investing in sustainability. But there's a cruel irony here. The carbon tax is actually preventing them from investing further in emissions reduction technologies. When a farmer pays tens of thousands per year just to continue current operations, they don't have working capital for upgrading to more efficient grain dryers, switching to electric heating where possible, or implementing biogas systems. The carbon tax, intended to incentivize emissions reduction, forces farmers to maintain status quo operations because they can't afford to invest in improvements. Feedlot operators explain this to Parliament. Their sector embraces innovative practices supporting competitiveness and sustainability. To compete in integrated North American markets, cattle feeders carefully manage every input cost, including feed and fuel. They rely on natural gas and propane for essential practices like on-farm grain drying, steam flaking for feed preparation, and irrigation of feed crops. Financial relief from Bill C-234 would have supported a viable Canadian beef sector and represented opportunity for further investment in environmentally sound practices. Without that relief, they're stuck. The industry provided Parliament with comprehensive data. One farm documented a monthly carbon tax payment of $61,933. That same farm, if projections hold, faces bills exceeding $894,000 annually by 2030. This was just one farm. The Agriculture Carbon Alliance collected data from farms across multiple provinces and agricultural sectors. Extrapolating across Canada's 190,000 farms reveals staggering cumulative impact. Environmental groups like Equiterre and Environmental Defense opposed Bill C-234. Their concern was that exempting farming fuel would weaken the carbon pricing mechanism. They argued that existing rebate programs provided sufficient compensation. They warned that exemptions would undermine the carbon tax's purpose, which is incentivizing behavior change by making fossil fuels more expensive. This argument has theoretical merit. Carbon pricing is widely accepted among economists as efficient for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. By making fossil fuels more expensive, you supposedly encourage people and businesses finding alternatives or reducing consumption. The system works reasonably well for activities with viable alternatives. If gas prices rise, you might take transit, buy electric vehicles, or drive less. There are choices available. But agriculture is fundamentally different. A farmer cannot choose to not dry grain in wet years. A rancher cannot choose to not heat a barn during Canadian winters. There are no alternatives available at reasonable costs or scales. The carbon tax in agriculture is therefore not incentive for behavior change. It's a penalty for existing, for feeding Canadians and exporting food globally. It's punishment for doing exactly what society needs them to do. The concern about double dipping also overlooks that farmers are paying far more in carbon taxes than receiving in rebates. Rebate programs were never designed to fully compensate for essential operation carbon costs. They were designed to provide general assistance. There's no double dipping when the tax exceeds the rebate by hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's just underpayment for a burden imposed. Environmental advocates pointed to alternatives under development, like renewable energy and more efficient technologies. This is true, but development is slow and expensive. Most farms cannot completely overhaul energy systems while simultaneously paying massive carbon tax bills. The logic creates a catch-22. Invest in emissions reduction while paying penalties that eliminate your capital for investing in emissions reduction. It's economically illogical. Academic research examined Canada's carbon tax impacts on cattle specifically. Researchers from Western University conducted econometric analysis of Canada's carbon pricing on feedlots. They found that carbon pricing does influence beef farmers' decisions, and that exemptions meaningfully mitigate detrimental effects. The research confirmed what farmers were saying. The carbon tax changed behavior, but not necessarily in ways improving environmental outcomes. It pushed operations into less efficient configurations or encouraged relocation to provinces with different tax regimes. The effect was economically disruptive without clear environmental benefits because carbon costs weren't tied to actual emissions reductions. They were tied to fuel use regardless of efficiency. This brings us to the central paradox. The carbon tax policy, well-intentioned as it was, didn't account for agricultural production specifics. It applied a one-size-fits-all penalties to an industry with no alternatives. It reduced capital available for farmers to invest in actual emissions reduction technologies. It pushed costs onto consumers already struggling with food affordability. It threatened economic viability of an entire sector without providing a clear path to emissions reduction. The farmers testifying to Parliament weren't climate deniers. Many care deeply about environmental stewardship and have implemented sustainable practices on their operations. What they objected to was paying massive taxes for activities having no viable alternatives while watching their operational capacity to invest in actual improvements shrink year after year. In January 2025, something significant happened. The 44th Parliament ended, and Bill C-234 did not become law. It had passed the House, been amended in the Senate, returned to the House, but ultimately didn't progress further before Parliament dissolved. The bill's fate remains uncertain going forward. The elected House of Commons couldn't override the Senate amendments. But in March 2025, a major policy development occurred. A new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, took office and immediately announced plans to scrap the consumer portion of Canada's carbon tax, effective April 1st, 2025. The price on carbon for large industrial emitters remains in place, but the consumer levy affecting fuel, heating, and food production was eliminated. Agricultural organizations responded, saying this move provides much-needed relief. After years of struggling under carbon tax burdens, farmers would finally receive a break. However, it's worth noting that the industrial emissions pricing system remains. Some large agricultural operations, particularly massive feedlots or industrial-scale grain drying facilities, might still face costs under industrial pricing systems, though details on specific agriculture applications are still being clarified. The broader context involves fundamental questions about how Canada approaches both climate change and food security. The country has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture contributes about 12% of Canada's total emissions. More than half of agriculture's emissions come from animals or fertilizers used on feed crops. The sector must participate in emissions reduction. The question is how to do that without compromising Canadian agriculture viability. A country that cannot feed itself is vulnerable. A country importing all beef from nations with lower environmental standards isn't reducing global emissions. It's outsourcing emissions while still consuming the same amount. A country losing its agricultural workforce to economic pressure from ill-designed policies loses something it cannot easily regain. World situations provide instructive examples. New Zealand proposed capping emissions from livestock, becoming the first country attempting this. Backlash was swift and politically destabilizing. In the Netherlands, when the government proposed buying out livestock farmers as part of emissions reduction plans, it generated years of protests and fueled conspiracy theories. These experiences suggest poorly designed agricultural emissions policies create serious unintended political and social consequences. The Canadian context is unique. This nation has world-leading agricultural producers who operate under some of the world's strictest environmental regulations. Canadian farmers compete globally but face higher compliance costs than most competitors. When you add a substantial carbon tax, you make Canadian producers even less competitive against foreign operations with fewer environmental requirements. This creates a paradox for climate policy. If the goal is reducing global emissions, driving Canadian production offshore where emissions controls are weaker doesn't help. It simply relocates production to less sustainable operations. A global climate policy should recognize that world-leading producers in developed nations should be supported in maintaining operations, not taxed out of business. The testimony from farmers emphasized that they're ready to be part of climate solutions. They're not obstinate about environmental protection. They recognize changing climate patterns and their impacts on farming. They've been adopting innovations for decades. What they object to is being asked to pay massive taxes for activities having no viable alternatives, without compensation proportional to their actual costs. The story of Canadian cattle farmers and the carbon tax represents a crucial lesson for policymakers everywhere. Good environmental policy requires understanding sector realities. It requires genuine dialogue between policymakers and affected industries. It requires recognizing that one-size-fits-all approaches often fit no one properly. It requires remembering that food security, environmental protection, and farmer economic viability aren't competing goals. They're interconnected requirements for healthy societies. The cattle farmers of Canada have fed their country and the world for generations. They operate some of the world's most advanced, efficient agricultural operations. They're ready to participate in climate solutions. But they need policies enabling that participation rather than penalizing them for feeding the nation. That's the story of the carbon tax and Canadian cattle farmers, a story about the distance between good policy intentions and workable implementation, about an industry under economic stress, about choices made today determining what Canadian agriculture looks like tomorrow. It's a story still being written, with outcomes yet to be fully determined.